You talked about tankers. I know during Desert Storm, Riley Nixon had 4 carriers in the Red Sea. Took 2 aerial refuelings to get them up into Iraq, 2 aerial refuelings to come back. Operations into Afghanistan, carrier based off of Pakistan. 2 aerial refuelings to get up in the area, an aerial refueling to keep them in the area, 2 aerial refuelings to come back. During Vietnam, we had A6s that had a 1,500-mile combat radius. Today, our best is 600. And along the same lines, when you talk about stealth technology, I understand open source information, the development of new radars that are going to be able to counter our stealth technology. Did you look at any of that? The last thing, when you talked about what it costs us to negate a system, I see that they've got the new system on board the Ponce right now, the new air defense system, where they says it costs a couple of dollars to take down something, where in the past it would take $200,000 to take down. Did you look at things like that?
Absolutely. There's a lot of questions wrapped up in that opening, those remarks. First, I just agree. I mean, one of the issues with the carrier air wing is that its organic striking range has actually gone down over time because we increasingly relied on getting in close and maximizing air sortie generation. That was a choice. But if we're increasingly pushed further and further away because of these anti-access area denial threats, it's kind of a bad choice for the future. As far as the tanking goes, you're exactly right. I mean, I'm not exactly sure of the numbers, but and I think it's even going to be worse in the Pacific, given the even more extended lines from which we would need to be operating from, which is basically to say it's hard to fight a long-range air campaign with short-range aircraft, which is why one of the areas I suggested that we should rebalance the portfolio is from short-range systems to longer-range systems for that exact reason. We're still going to need tankers, but in terms of just being able to prosecute a high-tempo campaign, you have to have longer-range assets, and also those longer-range assets give you dwell time or loiter time in areas of interest. On the stealth piece, you know, the low-observable, counter-low-observable competition has been going on for decades. Every decade, there's someone who raises their hand and says, stealth is going away. And then we figure out a new way to counter whatever the latest thing is. So yes, I've taken that into consideration. I don't think stealth is going away. I think that there's things we can do, both actively and passively, to deal with emerging threats. And that's probably about all I can say, and you know, without going into a classified discussion. And directed energy is one of those areas that's been right around the corner for like the last 20 years. I think we're actually turning the corner on directed energy, and as you said, we're doing the demonstration with the solid-state laser on the Ponce, and I'm hoping that we'll get a higher power solid-state laser on a DDG in the not too distant future, 2016, 2017, 2018, and start integrating them into the next flight of DDGs. Because again, they do offer, I'm not exactly sure the cost, George, but it's more like tens of dollars versus millions of dollars when you look at the higher end interceptors. So it will really help us with the cost exchange ratio. Next question.
Hi, James Padell. I was really interested in the operational concept you've developed through as part of the sort of the global surveillance strike network. What was coming to mind is have the wider consideration of an offset strategy. You've gone for a sort of a concept around which people can rally, if you like, as opposed to how do we address the global proliferation of technology, the need to be more agile, to pick up innovation as it arrives. So I'm thinking of the impact in the wider defence enterprise, be that staffing, training, acquisition reform, rather than the specific focus. Because I always see I had this view in my mind of the third offset strategy not being something tangible that you can start to work towards, but more enabling the process to take account of innovation as it comes along.
I guess I'd like to have my cake and eat it too on that point. I think that we collectively as a national security enterprise need to do better about harvesting cutting-edge technology, including from the commercial sector, which is leading it in several areas now. And we really need to streamline the defense acquisition process, because right now it just it's too Byzantine, it takes too much time, it imposes too much red tape, and in many cases we're deploying systems that are, you know, decades later that are essentially technologically obsolete by the time they field. So we got to do better. And in several of these areas, you know, robotics, for example, you know, the cycle times are so fast that we really need to do better about that. But one of the problems is, I think, a lot of the sources of innovation in some of these smaller, agile companies are disinclined to compete for DoD contracts because of all the red tape and regulations and oversight. You know, you're going to take my IP away, you're going to control my profit margin. Why should I go down this path? So we need to make it more attractive to those firms.
Hi. Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. My question, this is perhaps not the scenario that you were focused on, but what does this global surveillance strike network do about a situation like Crimea or a situation like the Islamic State, where, you know, in one case we've been bombing not particularly enthusiastically, but for a while, and without a ground force, not much has happened. And of course, this was, you know, arguably the great problem with the Eisenhower New Look, is that we had, you know, the capacity to nuke the hell out of people, but if we weren't willing to do that, you know, we ended up sort of backing into Vietnam and doing terribly,
Right.
At great expense.
That's a great question. I was pretty much assuming some version of that question would come up at some point. I guess my answer would be, first off, that this is not meant to be a national defense strategy or national security strategy, but rather a more focused strategy looking at how do we restore our conventional power projection capability, including against adversaries that have A2AD type capabilities. So it's not meant to solve all problems. Just like the offset strategy in the 1970s was not a comprehensive national defense strategy. It was focused on a relatively narrow problem: how to deal with a 3-to-1 Warsaw Pact numerical advantage on the Central Front in Europe. There are all kinds of other problems around the world, including insurgencies and terrorism and other things that really did not address. So I'd say, in part, this global surveillance strike system or network concept is not going to address so much subconventional threats like you see in the Ukraine and Crimea, or insurgencies in various parts of the world, or Ebola in Africa. You know, now that said, if you had persistent ISR and precision strike pretty much where you wanted it, when you wanted it, that could be very advantageous for whatever other tools you're using to deal with, say, subconventional threats or counterinsurgency. You know, take, for example, the opening phase of Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, where you had a handful of SOF on the ground and CIA folks on the ground, basically 200 folks, I think it was, more or less, until the fall of Kandahar. How? Enabling unconventional warfare with the Northern Alliance combined with persistent U.S. air power. Now, the problem is there's lots of places in the world where we couldn't do that because of the air defense threat. So how can you create that ISR and persistent strike capacity where and when you want around the world? And that's the idea behind this global surveillance strike concept. So I guess my say, you know, it doesn't have to solve all the problems, but it potentially could solve the power projection problem, and could also be a big enabler to other approaches to other challenges. Does that?
Yeah, to complement what my colleague said, I think we came to a realization looking back on the earlier offset strategies and just the other work we do. There's no sort of Swiss Army knife military system that handles all threats, all problems, all the time. One of the interesting things, I think, again, working with Bob on this, is he pointed out that, in a sense, if you look at the end of the Eisenhower administration, you find that we had an advantage in the nuclear competition, a major advantage, which, of course, played out in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But also, we're at the point where we still were able to leverage important advantages in conventional warfare. What President Kennedy said was, okay, we have the nuclear advantage. We showed in Korea that we could combat the forces of aggression with conventional forces. These guys are going to move to wars of national liberation. And I think what we're likely to see is driving the competition down into proxy warfare. It's if I could predict something coming out of Bob's work, it's that in a sense, what we're doing is avoiding, hopefully, deterring the higher risk kinds of military conflict and driving the competition down into the less threatening areas. Of course, that doesn't mean you don't work to have a strategy to deal with that, but certainly I'd rather deal with what we used to call brush fire wars than major conventional wars.
But just to play devil's advocate, what if you have a Crimea-like situation where a country that actually has engaged in Haiti says, basically grabs territory, says, okay, fait accompli, you can bomb, we care about this more than you do. You can bomb us all you like. We bombed the Vietnamese for however many years. But as long as you don't come in and dig us out on the ground, be it with robots or whatever,
Right.
we don't, we'll take the price and rally around our glorious leader.
So let me say two things. First off, if you had the persistent forward presence or rapidly deployable surveillance strike capabilities, I could potentially forestall that fait accompli. Because once an adversary has achieved something, it's kind of in the defensive mode, it's more costly and time-consuming to try to reverse that. So that would be point one. So with this type of capability, I'd be better able to forestall that. The second point is that this type of ISR surveillance network could provide the umbrella under which your SOF or your unconventional paramilitary forces engage the adversaries' similar type forces. But if you don't have that umbrella, they can constantly use their conventional capabilities to prevent your paramilitary SOF type forces from engaging. Does that make sense?
Or to prevent your ACTs from engaging.
Well, that's a separate question, but yeah. Yeah.
Otto Kreischer with Sea Power Magazine. Given the constrained resources for what you're doing, apparently you would want the Navy to shift its budget away from building more DDGs and carriers and put more into submarines.
Again, I think it's a question of balance, and I think over time, trying to maintain or expand the attack submarine fleet would be, I think, well advised. To take steps to increase overall undersea payload capacity, whether that's through UUVs, external payload modules that are towed by submarines or that are put on the seabed by surface ships or submarines, I think all of that makes sense. I think that we get a lot of mileage out of our undersea forces, and the question is, how do we do more? And right now, as I said, the trend is down. We're having declining undersea payload in a time where I think we're going to need more. So those resources need to come from somewhere, and if not within the Navy, maybe from outside the Navy in terms of overall budget shares.
Bob, let me ask you a question based on what Otto just asked you. Doesn't that, isn't it an important factor in terms of the submarine carrier mix have to do with what steps we take to make the carrier, as you have in your study,
Right,
more relevant in this kind of a fight?
Right. I mean, so one of the questions is, hey, how many carriers? Then the next question is, or what I would suggest is, for the carrier to be useful in the future, we really need to think about the composition of the carrier air wing. And in particular, we need to get an aircraft on the carrier deck that has longer range, better survivability. Otherwise, I think you begin to question the strategic utility and operational utility of the carrier. And certainly you'd start to question, how many do you need? But if you're going to have them, at whatever number we can afford, they need to have meaningful operational offense capacity. And to get that, we need something with longer range and more survivability than is currently planned.
Good morning, Lieutenant Smith. I work here at OLA. My question, again, going back to the global surveillance strike system, I was wondering if you could provide a little bit more granularity on, what systems we need, and that might go into the UAV category, but what is our surveillance doing now that you would like to see it do in the future? Do you foresee different link systems or new sensors that have not been harnessed properly by the Navy or the Air Force, et cetera?
I guess I'd kind of take you back to this chart, which is admittedly a little hard to grasp. But I think the challenge is right now, across the Joint Force, most of our capabilities are down here in the low to medium environment or in the regional sort of environment. So in the general thrust, I'd say we need more things that have global responsiveness or can survivably persist forward, like submarines, and that are effective in medium and high threat environments. So then you look at this, and this is all new stuff. So these are things, all these things that have the highest utility are essentially new things that we're not currently on the path to field. So whereas down here, just taking the unmanned system, for example, we have hundreds of these. We have 60 some of these, 100 of these. We have hundreds of manned and unmanned ISR platforms that are in the low to medium threat environment. Up here, that's just not, we have much fewer resources. So again, I guess what I would say is we need to shift overall the surveillance strike portfolio more towards longer range systems, more survivable forward systems, and potentially increasingly unmanned systems because of the advantages they offer, both in terms of life cycle cost and mission endurance.
Hi, Andrea Shalal with Reuters. I wanted to follow up with a couple of more specific questions. So are you saying that the Air Force should not buy 1,763 F-35s, or is there something that can be done to extend their range? And when you say, back off of the modernization plans that are now there, could you be more specific and really, what programs should be reduced, gotten rid of? We saw, some of this back and forth between the Global Hawk U-2 discussion. How would your plan view those two systems specifically?
Well, on the Global Hawk U-2, I think that the Global Hawk, because of its very, very long range and high speed, so it gives it a lot of global responsiveness, is a very powerful ISR platform for low to medium threat environments. So the issue there is we need a complement to the Global Hawk that can operate in medium to high threat environments. On the fighter modernization issue, I think there's two questions. One is, how much fighter force structure do we need across the Navy, Marine Corps, and Air Force? That's question one. So that could be an area where you turn the dial slightly to free up resources for these other, I would say, higher priority investments. And then in terms of modernization, it's a question of degree. I think the full buy for the Air Force is A, probably not going to happen because I don't think they can afford it, but B, I wouldn't recommend it in any case. I think shifting towards a land-based aerial refuelable UCAS would make much more sense for the Air Force over time. Does that mean they don't need air superiority multi-role fighter like the F-35 for many areas of the world? Yeah, they do. And so it's a question of balance. It's a question of degree. For the Navy, Navy has more options with the F-35C. So I think the one question to look at, and I think more analysis needs to be done in this area, is what is the best composition of the carrier air wing over time? So, for example, what's the trade-off in terms of performance and cost between the F-35C and an advanced Super Hornet over the next couple decades? And then where in time do you bring in a carrier-based stealthy UCAS, and how does it compete with F-35C or an advanced Super Hornet? So what's the right mix of squadrons, and how do they get phased in over time to give the biggest bang for the buck for the carrier air wing? I don't have the answer. I firmly believe that a long-range, significant payload, stealthy UCAS is part of the answer for the carrier air wing. I'm just not sure how many will be required and what the best complement is between F-35Cs and future advanced Super Hornets. Does that answer?
So this is a question that's been bothering me since they announced this third offset strategy, and I really can't get an answer. I mean, isn't the military supposed to have been doing this all the time? I mean, aren't they supposed to be trying to stay ahead of potential foes? And, you know, so why is an offset strategy needed? Like, what got us to this point? Is it the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that people took their eye off the far range ball, or is it that the threat the threat assessment has changed? What are the specific things? And then finally, how much of what you've sketched out here is already going on behind the in the black world? And how far along do you think they are in that?
Well, I can't answer that one, I'm pretty sure.
In broad terms.
I don't have a great explanation to your first question. I think part of it is, as Andrew mentioned in his opening remarks, is complacency following the end of the Cold War and the huge advantages we had relative to adversaries around the world. And we exploited that advantage, is really this monopoly in the second offset strategy for several decades. And I think the handwriting has been on the wall now for a while, that adversaries have been looking at this. China in particular comes to mind, but also Russia, Iran, and others, and trying to identify weaknesses in how we project power, and they've now developed and increasingly are fielding capabilities to do that. I think this has been recognized for a little while. You go back and look at the 2001 QDR and the 2006 QDR, and this problem of anti-access area denial, it's in there going back over that period of time. The problem is it's hard to, especially when you're engaged in the wars we've been engaged in since 2001, 2003, to make those shifts. And then secondly, the DoD is a big bureaucracy with entrenched institutional interests in the services, and it's hard to get that oil tanker to turn. So I guess that would be my answer. Andrew, you have
just a little bit of personal history to add. In the early 1990s, when I was working for Andrew Marshall in the Pentagon, and the whole issue of the revolution in military affairs was being developed, Marshall's argument to the senior defense leadership was, look, we have this enormous lead right now. So there's no need to plow a lot of money into the next big thing, okay, because we can ride this lead for quite some time. Similar to, I guess, to some extent what Eisenhower said is we have this enormous lead in nuclear weapons. Let's not break our budget by competing against ourselves. And his point was that what you really needed to do was to think about what happens when the other guy has the kind of capabilities you have now. Essentially what Bob talked about, he talked about the reconnaissance strike complex, which was a term the Soviets used for what we had. The ability to see over a wide area and scout, and the ability to hit targets at great distances with precision. And now, as Bob points out, we're beginning to see that. It took a long time to come about, but we're beginning to see it. We probably began to see it about 10 years or so ago, but the war was a distraction. And quite frankly, in the early 90s, all Marshall was telling the military services is this: you don't need to spend money. You just need to think about where you would go in these kinds of circumstances. There were some attempts made. For example, I guess the classic example is the Army's Future Combat System. That was designed to deploy into austere areas and do everything but the laundry. And you ended up with systems that Secretary Gates called so exquisite. The performance parameters were off the charts. And so in a sense, when the services did think about this, they kind of pegged the meter. What we ended up with, of course, as you know, is a lot of canceled programs as budgets became tight and the technology just didn't mature the way that we hoped it would. So as President Kennedy once said, victory has 1,000 fathers, but defeat was an orphan. I think in this case, defeat had 1,000 fathers in terms of a lot of false starts toward really beginning to move along this path. And now the wolf isn't at the door. But as Bob pointed out, more and more countries are acquiring these kinds of A2AD capabilities. So the wolf is prowling around in the yard. And I think it's a good thing that the wolf isn't at the door, and I think it's a good thing that Bob's talking about how to keep the wolf at arm's length.
That's good.
Hello, sir. Edgar from I work in DoD, and I think this is a great project because you've sort of compiled all these tangibles into one. But my question is, how does this strategy address our adversaries' force structure and innovation in the future? And I mentioned, for example, a lot of these technologies are probably good at countering the current force structure that some of our adversaries have today. But in the future, perhaps it's in your advanced engineering section, and I take China, for example, looking at their open research that they publish very openly, their advances in quantum encryption is going to improve their protection of C4ISR, their innovations in material sciences. So while this strategy looks very nice in addressing, for example, some of the challenges posed by China and Russia today, what elements of the strategy address China and Russia in 10, 15 years?
That's a hard question to answer, in part because I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know how things are going to evolve exactly. But I'd say two things. I mean, one, there are some clear trends about, for example, China's approach to power projection, which is heavily missile-focused. I think this approach is very much responsive to that. And another thing so I don't see anything in terms of where China's going in terms of its R&D and its modernizations that would negate this approach. Second, I picked these areas as key enduring advantages because I really do believe they're enduring, and that I don't think there's anything that's going on that's really going to anytime soon rapidly depreciate our investments in these areas. And then third, I would also stress, and I should have said this earlier, is that it's important when thinking about the A2AD challenge that it's not about countering A2AD per se. Countering A2AD is a means to an end, and that end is projecting power. So if I can project power and evade his A2AD and render it irrelevant, that's fine. Now, sometimes I may need to actually actively counter his A2AD by jamming or going after some sensors or defending against some missiles. That's not the end of the day. That's not the end game. The end game is being able to project power, and that's something that I think we can do with this type of global surveillance strike network. And then I'd also turn your question around and say, okay, knowing what I know about what Iran is doing or China's doing or North Korea is doing, what are the things I should not do? Well, one of them is I probably shouldn't invest in short-range, non-stealthy aircraft, for example. So, yes. Oh.
Thank you.
Hi, sir. Lieutenant J.G. Johansson from Desron 22. Current unmanned systems rely heavily on SATCOM links, high-bandwidth SATCOM links. These systems are vulnerable to jamming and destruction, as you've mentioned. But as are aerial systems, how do you mitigate these vulnerabilities in, say, the situation of a over-the-horizon stealthy unmanned strike?
So I guess I push back on your premise a little bit in that we've come a long way from Predator-like UAVs that need to be sort of manually flown remotely to things like Global Hawk and Triton or BAMs, which are basically autonomous platforms that go where they're told and fly more or less by themselves. But to be fair, the way you mitigate satellite or communication path vulnerability is through increased autonomy. So the more autonomous these systems can become over time, the better, because it will reduce our dependence on that bandwidth. So then the question is, can I get that bandwidth in other ways other than SATCOM? So, for example, I can think of ways to use UAVs and aerostats, for example, to create a terrestrial airborne layer as a complement to space. I can think of ways of creating gateways for RF to get into the global information grid and use the fiber optic system that's all throughout the seafloor. So there are things I can do to reduce my dependence on SATCOM, both in terms of alternative communication paths and increased autonomy.
Thank you. Leandra Bernstein, Russian Press. Specific questions on threats related to Russia. Just how did you perceive incidents like Russia testing their long-range bombers, developing systems similar to our GMD systems and THAAD systems? How much did you take those developments specifically into account, as well as the space-based surveillance systems, which recently were able to successfully detect the missile launches back in November?
I say, I did take them into account. I think this general approach is consistent with where we see Russia developing capabilities. And I'd add to the list, electronic warfare and cyber are big things that we need to incorporate into our thinking about how to make these networks survivable in the face of those types of capabilities. And then I think a challenge for us, too, is that many of these cutting-edge systems that Russia is developing now are also available for export. S-300, S-400, SA-10, SA-20 class integrated air defense systems are proliferating around the world. So we need to make sure we have the ability to operate in airspace that's defended by those types of systems.
Yes, Dale Smith, Lockheed Martin. I'm curious, how does the center think about balancing investment in long-range strike land-based systems versus long-range strike carrier-based systems? I mean, I assume it's more than just justifying a continuation of the number of carrier battle groups. So, what's your thought process on that balance?
That's a really good question. I think being land-based offers a number of advantages in that you're not constrained by the size of the width dispersion for the carrier deck, which basically means you can have longer-range aircraft that can carry more payload. So being land-based has many advantages. So something like the LRSB makes a great deal of sense. And having a lot of payload on the LRSB, really it provides the hammer for going after large concentrations of targets, deep inland targets, hardened and deeply buried targets. What it's less good for, because it's only one plane, is hunting down mobile, widely distributed targets. There, a better solution is more aircraft with less payload. So then the question becomes, for that type mission set, the mobile target killer mission, what do you want to be? Do you want to be land-based or carrier-based? Again, being carrier-based, you could potentially have longer range and more payload, which is attractive. However, then you do have to operate from fixed airfields, which are potentially vulnerable. So the carrier gives you, I think, a complement to that forward, smaller, land-based UCAS that's at sea, where you can position the carrier wherever you want to have multiple azimuths of attack against a given adversary. So I think it's the flexibility the carrier gives you in terms of geolocation that makes it attractive. But I think there's a combination between the two. And specifically, while both can obviously be used for fixed targets and potentially for some deep inland targets, I think the real value is if you can have forward, whether it's, but still defensible in terms of the land-based and carrier-based, air refuelable UCAS, it would allow you to cover down on wide geographic areas with a relatively small number of aircraft because of their mission endurance. So whether it's a land-based or a carrier, you fly them forward, they fly for 5-10 hours, come back, hit the tanker, go back in, hunt for targets 10 hours, whatever, 20 hours, come back out, and you can just keep doing that. It's a very cost-effective way to cover down on a wide area of geography.
I was wondering what kind of role do you see U.S. allies like Japan playing in this whole endeavor? Thank you.
I think that's a great question. I think there's R&D opportunities and, for instance, unmanned systems and automation that would be Japan could be a close partner in, as well as directed energy. I think that in terms of the capability areas that I discuss, again, unmanned systems is an area both air and at sea and undersea. I think sensor networks is another area. I think alternatives, terrestrial alternatives to space is another area. I think Japan is already a great undersea power, and working with Japan to exploit the undersea domain more extensively would be another area. And then lastly, the whole issue of basing and access and logistics and all of that. The geography of Japan is hugely valuable strategically for all that type of investment as well.